tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
This is Chad Graham with Thinker Sensitive on the rise of socialism. I'm here with Ben Crenshaw, my co-host, and Nicholas Mashanya for this episode on socialism versus communism. Guys, thanks for coming today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I want to dive right in here and talk about the differences, some distinctions between socialism and communism. But first, let's talk about how they're related, Ben.
Absolutely. So these two terms have a history, and as you trace them throughout history and how they're used, they change. So let's just kind of walk through that carefully so that we understand historically how they've been used and what they mean today. So if we go back to the early utopian socialists in the 1830s and 40s, at that point, socialism was a kind of a social and economic theory of just how people ought to relate to one another. Communism was the revolutionary theory. That was the radical idea of abolishing classes, of any kind of hierarchy or aristocracy or something like that, having a classless society. So it was seen as a very revolutionary, kind of a fringe idea. So what happened with the advent of Marxism and the work of Marx and Engels is that they tried to take what's known as a scientific socialist approach to things. So Marx had his dialectic, and I won't go into all the details, but he thought his dialectic was a scientific theory, a scientific and historical theory of how the world kind of naturally unfolds historically throughout time. And of course, he thought that capitalism was one phase that would lead to communism and the classless society. So what Marx ended up doing was he was the one who actually came up with the label utopian and placed it upon the early socialists because he was distinguishing their ideals from his scientific theories. So when Marx and Engels wrote about socialism and communism, they kind of used the terms interchangeably. But they distinguished that from their dialectic, their view of history, economic determinism and historical determinism.
And so they kind of saw themselves as progressive utopians, though.
Yes.
Right,
yeah. If you read Marx and Engels, you'll find that Marx eschews utopianism in terms of some idealistic perfect state. He didn't really believe in that. And he was willing to sacrifice blood, sweat, and tears and generations in order to reach this classless society. So, and he wasn't a utopist because he didn't believe about like dreaming about the future and then trying to realize it. He said he believed that things would happen the way they would happen. His dialectic is this idea of a caterpillar and a chrysalis, and it will, because of its DNA, turn into a butterfly. And the same thing with economic theories was like you move from this socialism into this capitalism, and it will, by its very nature, through things like the revolution of the proletariat and so forth, it will inextricably transform into a classless communist society. And there was no stopping it. There was nothing you can do. It was history. It was determined. So then what ended up happening, of course, was the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. And Lenin rose to power at that time, and he reigned until 1924 at his death. And what Lenin tried to do was put flesh and blood. He tried to put meat on the bones of the Marxist philosophy. And so at that point, socialism was communism, and the Russian communism was a form, a type of socialism, a manifestation of it. But then after, because of the negativity of the communist revolution and the communism of the 20th century, that left a bad flavor in people's mouths. So after that, socialists sought to kind of drive a wedge between socialism and communism and turn socialism into something other than communism. And that's where you get the rise of democratic socialism.
So then, Ben, is democratic socialism different than communism? Is there a difference, or are they one and the same? Does one lead to the other? Does democratic socialism, because it's based more on that theory, but when you instantiate it and cash it out, it actually devolves into communism? Is that true?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's definitely a large truth to that. Now, if you read a democratic socialist today, they'll say things like, democracy is the means by which the people are going to participate in all areas of life, and we're going to give them decision-making power over, their lives and the things that affect them so that they can have a flourishing life. So they eschew things like authoritarianism, or abuse of power and oppression, or poverty and things like that. The problem is that the ideals of socialism, even as they are articulated by democratic socialists, when they are implemented, I think can't not lead to some form of modern day communism. You just can't hold to their ideals and get their outcomes without relying on some kind of coercive and abusive state power that's going to take away people's rights, take away people's property, disrupt prices, disrupt flow of goods and exchanges within the market, and is really going to crimp people's lives and take away their economic freedom. You just can't. I just don't see how you can possibly do it. And so it may not look like the communism of the past. We may not have gulags or 100 million people die under Stalin and Mao, but it would be some kind of political tyranny in order to achieve this economic ideal.
Economic bankruptcy, just economic chaos.
Yes.
Even if we don't have death camps and death squads and things like that.
Yes, absolutely. So the democratic socialists today would resist that. They don't want to be communists, but I don't think that and part of the problem is they don't really tell us how practically they would achieve their ideals without leading to communism.
Yeah.
And the reason that they appeal to values and ideals such as liberty and fraternity and equality and equal outcomes is that that's their strong suit. Their strong suit is selling socialism as a morally superior philosophy. But when you ask them, okay, how would you do that? They kind of come up short. There's really fuzzy. And then if you press them on, well, why wouldn't that lead to abuse and tyranny or the restriction of human freedom and moral agency and so forth? And then, it devolves from there.
Yeah, or there's this temptation to rely on the idea of a direct democracy as a safeguard. So, we exchange the single totalitarian leader, the dictator, for the dictation of the masses, basically. And so we can't just say that because we institute democracy in a socialist economic ordering or political ordering, that necessarily protects us from some sort of malfeasance or violent uprising. It just means that we do so democratically.
Right.
We just choose it that way. And it doesn't necessarily have to go that way, but when we look at history and see every time that this has been tried in the past, spanning every continent and every culture and every time period, it just always devolves into this strongman authoritarianism or extreme poverty.
Exactly. And part of the reason for that is because socialists are very optimistic about human nature.
Yes.
And they take an unconstrained vision in which we'll finally find the beneficent dictator. They wouldn't call it a dictator, but a leader. A charismatic leader like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or somebody who's going to come along and they're going to have the right policies that's really going to give us what we want without recognizing that they are human and they are fallible and they will fail and they are selfish just like all the rest of us. And if we don't have decentralized power and checks and balances, it will absolutely devolve into an authoritarian regime that is extremely abusive.
Right.
Now, Chad, there's one other thing I want to quickly touch on in this issue between the abstract notion of socialism and the concrete implementation of communism, because that's really one of the key relationships between these two. In a previous podcast, we talked about the definition of socialism. And what you'll find if you go to look up socialism, there's a lot of different definitions. We covered some of them. Well, one of them I found was in the Oxford Dictionary of Economics, which you think would be a relatively safe and reputable source. They defined socialism as the idea that the economy's resources should be used in the interests of all its citizens rather than allowing private owners of land and capital to use them as they see fit. Now notice the idealism here. Mm-hmm. It's this lofty ideal that, all of a society's resources should be used in the interests of everybody. Okay, what does that look like? How is that done?
Who's going to determine interests?
And the problem is not only does it automatically assume that private ownership and capital can't do that, but it kind of it kind of grabs this ideal and makes it the property of socialists themselves. Kind of say, we'll hold this ideal of equitable use of resources. You other capitalists or whoever you are, you can't believe that. But that's not true.
Right.
You meet more than one market advocate who will say, I believe the exact same thing, and I'm willing to tell you exactly how we can do it. And not just at a local level, but at a national level, in a way that respects people's rights, that gives them property, that has free exchange, that has prices that properly reflect supply and demand and all kinds of things, and that leads everybody better off. So capitalists need to be bold in claiming these values ourselves and not being bullied into thinking that, oh, well, capitalism is just efficient. It works. I know it's the best of the worst of the economic systems out there. No. It is virtuous.
Yes.
It is good. And we should claim these values and ideals that socialists try to grab and make their own themselves.
So it's fair to say that all communists are socialists, but not all socialists are communists. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair, because all the communists were attempting to implement some sort of socialist philosophy. I do think that any attempt to put flesh and blood, put the meat on the bones of socialism, is going to end up in some kind of authoritarian regime with the breakdown in law and order and the roughshod of human rights and poverty and the abuse and misuse of resources. So it's not going to be like communism in China, or in Vietnam, or in Cambodia, or in Cuba. Those are unique historical iterations, but it's going to be something like it, something like we see in Venezuela today. I don't know if we'd say Venezuela is a communist nation, but there's definitely a strong man in power who is oppressing the people, taking the money and the resources for himself, and killing or jailing anyone who disagrees.
And even if there aren't death camps, and even if it's not Holocaust. I mean, when you have an exodus the size that Venezuela is facing right now, you can't help but take notice and say, okay, what would drive 1 million people to flee? That's serious.
Exactly. And what we need to do here is we need to understand the human cost. If you ever want to be staggered, read the Black Book of Communism. And you're going to read page after page of people, flesh and blood people like you and me, with hopes and dreams and desires and aspirations and lives lived and families whose lives were snuffed out because of a toxic and poisonous ideal that was implemented the best they knew how, and it turned out to be a horrendous bloodbath. We just can't allow that to happen again.
And it's not fair for us to say that democratic socialists are communists. That is a misnomer.
Right.
But it is fair to warn against how democratic socialism can devolve and shift into communism so quickly.
Exactly. And when you look at democratic socialists, you can go to some of their sites and read, and what do they come up with? They come up with these policies like, a universal basic income, or healthcare for all, or Medicare for all, or free college. But when you cash out what that looks like, it does lead to a breakdown of society.
Right.
And then you have further problems down the road. You have a bankrupt nation. You have a devalued currency. You have all kinds of issues. So these policies can sound benevolent and charitable on their face, and they can sound really wonderful. Utopian, exactly. And the key about utopian is that it's not. This is not a virtue. Literally, it comes from the Greek, and it means an utopos, a no place. Not just something that doesn't exist now, but it can exist. Right. It's a no place. So anybody who labels themselves as a utopian socialist and says, I'm striving for this ideal and I believe we can get there, they're a fool.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't a virtue. This isn't something to admire in someone. It's something to be concerned about and to put the brakes on.
Ben, thank you so much for being with us today. That is Socialism versus Communism. We have a couple more policy episodes coming up: universal basic income, universal health care, free college tuition, and no, just kidding. Ben, thank you so much for coming today. Nicholas, it's good to have you in the studio. Thanks, guys.
Right on. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
For more Thinker-Sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com. Be sure to find us on iTunes and YouTube as well.